Welcome, and to many of you, welcome back to the chapel of St. Catherine's College for this service in which we remember and celebrate Michael's life. This is a place that meant a great deal to Michael, and I know it is a special place for many of you as well. I hope that our time here today in this place and in the company of one another will be a blessing to you all in your time of grief. When we remember a long life well lived, when we do that, and as we gather in this place to remember Michael's long and fruitful life, we will each have different stories to tell, different sets of memories that capture who he was and what he meant to us. And there is room for all our thoughts and feelings today, in the words that are spoken, in the silences that we will keep together, and in the music that we have already heard and that we will hear later. Today, each of us will probably learn something that we did not know, because a human life is a rich and complex and beautiful thing, and is composed of many stories to be told and retold, shared and recombined through the passing years and through the passing generations. A good life story is not just a list of names and dates and places, but is rather a capturing of a person's character, what made them who they were, how they came to be who they were, and the ways that they were part of how each of you were formed and shaped and became who you are. A good life story tells us something of what a person meant and still means. The tributes today will tell just some of these stories, sharing some of the formative experiences upon which Michael built his life. And the readings that we will hear will reflect on the values that shaped his life. A little later in this service, we will hear Eli read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, included at Michael's own request. These iconic words were originally written for a community that had been through the mill, and so the reading promotes a way of living that upholds love, real love, as the bedrock for a good society. This is what Michael longed for and sought to model in his own life. Our first reading, too, provides a blueprint for a way of life, one which Michael was immersed in at an early age through his experience at St. Christopher's School. The school, for those of you who don't know, and I didn't know before I spoke to family members about it, the school was founded by Quakers, and in that tradition, discipline was effected through reparation rather than punishment. Authority was enacted not through prefects, but through service. And students were supported to organise and motivate themselves. This was an environment in which Michael thrived, and its values stayed with him throughout his life. These same values are reflected beautifully and challengingly in the words that follow, written by Linda Ellis and read for us today by Charlotte.
I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on his casket from beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of his birth and spoke of the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time that he spent alive on earth. And now, only those who loved him know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash.
If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and I deliver my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For our knowledge is imperfect, and our prophecy is imperfect. But when the perfect comes, the imperfect will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood. So faith, hope, love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love.
Hello, and thank you all for coming here today in these lovely surroundings to celebrate Michael, Uncle Michael, Grandpa, Dad's life. I am Annabelle, Michael's eldest daughter. We heard in our first poem of the dash between the years. I am going to attempt to fill out some of that dash and how Dad spent it. It's a very long dash, 93 years and almost a month, and it was packed pretty full. I'm aided by the fact that Dad, in his meticulous way, left notes about his life, though, rather dauntingly, they run to 12 sides of typed A4. Of necessity, I have had to be selective. Dad was born in June 1931 to his mother Winifred, a secretary, whose father, Herbert Lee, had been town clerk for Walsall. Dad's father, Martin Chisholm, was a correspondent for Picture Post and then for Reuters during the Second World War. Martin's father, the Reverend W.C. Chisholm, was a minister in the Scottish Church. Martin and Winifred separated when Dad was 1 or 2 years old and then divorced. They both remarried. Martin married Marion and they lived in a cottage known as Beanstalk at the foot of the South Downs. They had 2 children, Ian and Lynn, Dad's brother and sister. When Dad was 8 years old, Winifred married Vladimir Kahan, a doctor whose family were of Russian Jewish origin from Latvia. Vladimir served as a medical officer of health with the armed forces in the Middle East and in India. Dad's main memories of his childhood years are of living from 1940 to 1950 in a thatched cottage at Weston, a village about 4 miles from Letchworth. For most of that time, Dad cycled to his school, St Christopher's in Letchworth. He recounted one day when he had had a puncture on the way and arrived late. "What's your excuse, Chisholm?" he was asked. Dad, with his typical precision with words, replied, "I don't have an excuse. I have a reason," and explained what had happened. No more was said. The years at Weston were idyllic, with the freedom to climb trees, roam the fields and woods, gathering mushrooms and firewood. They grew vegetables, and Dad did quite a lot of the gardening. During the war, Dad and Winifred cycled to Ogwen in Snowdonia, where they walked. He went on camping trips, organised by Oscar Backhouse, his geography teacher, and, again travelling by bicycle, youth hosteling trips, organised by the maths master, including all the way to Land's End. These years gave him an abiding pleasure in the outdoors and in physical activity. Having done his national service in the Royal Engineers, Dad came up to St Catharine's College in 1951 to read geography. I'm not sure if it was the entrance exam or tripos exams later on, but he told of sitting a paper where the questions that he could answer were limited. Looking more carefully at some of the questions he had initially discarded, he realised that the essay title, Write About Turkey, was printed with a lowercase t. Knowing nothing about the country, he wrote about Christmas dinner. He was an exhibitioner for all 3 years, so it can't have counted against him too much. His supervisor at St Catherine's was Gus Caesar, and the group of undergraduates was really strong, including Peter Haggett, Peter Hall, and Gerald Manners. They used to go off cycling and motorbiking together in the long vacation, getting as far as the Pyrenees on one occasion, I believe. They all went on to have illustrious careers in their chosen fields and were lifelong friends and colleagues of Dad. By the end of the war, Winifred and Vladimir had separated. Vladimir in 1955 marrying Barbara, who was the children's officer for Oxfordshire. Barbara and Vladimir were a great source of stimulation, support, and love for many years, and Dad found it a great joy to have them in Cassington near Oxford when he first started work as a departmental demonstrator in the Institute for Research in Agricultural Economics. During this period, he met and married Edith, my mother, and they then moved to Hammersmith in London so that Dad could take up a post as assistant lecturer and later lecturer in geography at Bedford College. I was born in 1960, followed by Julia, my sister, in 1962. For a year, 1964 to 5, Dad held the post of visiting senior lecturer in geography at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. Mum, Julia, and I went out there for 6 months during that year, travelling by ship and living in a house provided by the university. Dad took the unorthodox decision that during the year in Nigeria, he would not attempt to do any research or writing on Nigerian matters, on the basis that it would be only after a year of reading, talking, and travelling that he might just begin to understand this entirely novel environment and its people. We did travel, I remember, to Bida, where I encountered the sound of a muezzin calling the people to prayer for the first time, and we saw silver bowls being hammered into shape and engraved. I think Dad also went to Timbuktu. I was 4, and Julia only 2, so it must have been a big upheaval to take us both out there. By 1965, we were back in the UK, in Bristol, for Dad's post as lecturer in geography. He later became reader, and then held the personal chair of Professor of Economic and Social Geography. We lived in a small village, Ulverston, at first, and Andrew was born in 1966. We then moved to a house called Ferns Hill, between Henbury and Avonmouth, where there was enough space for Dad to set about creating a vegetable garden. He built us a sand pit, erected a climbing frame, and looped a swing over the branch of a wonderful old yew tree that was really flexible. It was great fun to swing on. There were family visits to Cassington to see Vladimir and Barbara, to Alfriston to visit Martin and Marion, and to Turney Road in London and later Bracefield in Hampshire to visit Ian and his family. Dad's sister, Lynn, was studying at Bristol University, choosing Bristol so that she could be close to Dad. He had visited her many times when she was a child and had shown his kindness in many ways, including bringing her little presents. One of those gifts, a book entitled Geography for Boys and Girls, inspired Lynn with a love for the subject. But even though she had studied geography at A-level, she chose a different subject at Bristol University because Dad would have been teaching her if she had read geography. Lynn remembers Dad as always kind, supportive, respectful, and encouraging. Had he stayed at Bristol, Dad would have become head of geography. But then Dad was appointed Professor of Geography at Cambridge to start in autumn 1976. We had already moved house to Harston, 5 miles south of Cambridge, just before Christmas 1975, as this was deemed less disruptive to the children's education. Dad weekly commuted between Bristol and Harston, leaving work on Friday afternoon and returning on Sunday afternoon. No easy task travelling cross-country before the M25 and M11 were built. For 20 years, Dad was Professor of Geography here and Head of Department for the first 8 years of that time. He was also very pleased to be made a Fellow of St Catharine's College, and this was, I think, a bit of a homecoming for him. The first few years in Cambridge were quite challenging, with the necessity to build from scratch the departmental administration, a major restructuring of the geography tripos, seeking improvements in equipment funding from the university, and a major upgrade and refurbishment to the building occupied by the geography department. Dad's tenacity in challenging received wisdom resulted in changes that enhanced the reputation of the geography department within the university and paved the way for further improvements. Dad also initiated the setting up and then running of a one-year postgraduate course, Environment and Development, which was the first course of its kind in the UK. The family lived in Harston, and later Dad moved to Oxford Road in Cambridge, where I would visit during vacations. In both houses, Dad made gardens. I still have in my garden now a miniature iris from the Oxford Road garden, which Dad, with typical generosity, gave me all those years ago. The Harston garden was large, and Dad dug a vegetable patch at the end. The Oxford Road garden was smaller, but had a shed at the end, and Dad used that to do woodwork, as well as store his garden and woodwork tools, some of which had come to him from his father, Martin. He made a set of mahogany shelves for one of the rooms and used the offcuts to make cheese boards, one of which I have still and use regularly. During his time at Oxford Road, Dad met Judith, and they married in December 1986. They moved to Clarendon Road, and Judith has brought much joy and happiness to the last 37 years of Dad's life. I'm going to backtrack a bit now, chronologically speaking. Alongside the university appointments, Dad concurrently held a number of public appointments. For 5 years, 1967 to 72, he was a member of the Social Science Research Council. He held posts on 2 local government commissions and was a member of the Rural Development Commission. In all of these roles, he initiated proposals which had far-reaching consequences for the governance and improvement of the communities of Shire England. As a child, I remember huge maps being spread out on the dining table as Dad pored over where exactly the boundary lines should be drawn. And when I was older, I remember having conversations with him about what made a community and how there were different, overlapping, multifaceted communities within an area. After his appointment to the Local Government Commission for England in 1992, Dad and Judith spent a lot of time getting to know Derbyshire in particular, the county to which he was assigned, and recommending it to me as a good holiday spot for our young family. He and Judith also travelled widely to Australia, rural Portugal, and Orkney, amongst other destinations. Feeling that he had had enough of teaching, examining, and committee meetings, Dad retired from his post at Cambridge University in 1996, becoming a non-stipendiary associate of the Department of Geography. He was very proud to be awarded, also in 1996, the research degree of Doctor of Science, the gown of which we can see here. But retirement was not a full stop. He became a member, later chair, of the Conservators of the River Cam, and helped to bring about the change the organisation needed to become a viable body going forward. He submitted evidence to the House of Lords Select Committee and to the House of Commons Environment Committee, arguing the case for local government to have greater financial freedom. He continued to write and publish, becoming very interested in the waterways of the Fens to the north of Cambridge, even if his curiosity challenged established views of the way those waterways had been formed and used. In later retirement, he continued to be active in promoting the causes that he held dear, particularly the Spalding Gentlemen's Society, which is now following Dad's work on a good financial footing with a grant-funded new building to house their collection. He was for several years also secretary to the Brooklands Avenue Area Residents Association. During his later years, Dad acquired 2 sons-in-law, 5 grandchildren, a nephew, 4 nieces, as well as great-nieces and great-nephews galore, and made the time to keep up with them all. He was generous with his time in visiting and helping them, and many of those younger generations have very fond memories of Dad. So, what I have outlined is some of how Dad spent his very long dash, And it was no surprise to me that Dad specifically chose 1 Corinthians 13 for this occasion. Though I can't include them all, many of you have shared messages and memories which have been a great support. I would like to end by summing up some of the qualities Dad brought to bear on those relationships in the words of some of the individuals whose lives Dad touched. In your messages, Dad was described as patient, kind, wise, gentle, warm and welcoming, lively, engaged, and always smiling. 2 direct quotes from family members. Grandpa's ability to wrap his head around complex matters, from politics to geography, mathematics, and even some elements of my complex businesses, is something that will stay with me for years to come. He was interested in everything, no matter whether it was his subject or completely out of his field, and no matter whose interest it was. I remember lengthy conversations, or maybe debates, at Christmases gone by about all sorts of topics. He was also incredibly quick-witted and would leave smiles on people's faces. Michael was an absolute stalwart. He always had time for me and always had a gentle way to guide me to a better path. Dad's love of the outdoors, of physical activity, travel, and most of all people, have impacted widely on us all. Dad recognised that people the world over have more similarities than differences, and that relationships between people are key. His door was always open, and he always had time and abundant love to share with us all.
Sean and I knew Michael for 40 years. He was an immensely kind and generous friend who would have done anything for us. Whenever we were with Judith and Michael, there was pace, there was fun, there was warmth. I feel immensely privileged to be asked to give this address today. Michael's subject, while he was a career academic, was economic and social geography and its role in public policy. He served on the Boundary Commission, the Rural Development Commission, and the Local Government Commission. He was a fellow of the British Academy. He reached the heights of his profession. One of his later books, co-authored with Professor Steve Leach, is entitled Botched Business, The Damaging Process of Reorganizing Local Government, 2006 to 8. A review of the book said, the authors make serious allegations. They have done enough to justify an investigation by the Select Committee, which would give the department an opportunity to respond to the charges that amount to allegations of incompetence or dishonesty, or both. Michael and others followed this up with articles and evidence to Parliament. One vignette read, Cornwall used PwC and claimed that this firm had verified its figures. But PwC's letter explicitly stated that it had not checked the assumptions or the arithmetic, nor had it carried out an audit of the financial case. After retirement, Michael turned his mind to a different field of research, the history of the Fens. But what drove him to do this? One was the sense of injustice he felt about the treatment of the Anglo-Saxons, who he felt, quotes, had been airbrushed out of history. The orthodox story was that nothing major had been done between the Romans and the Normans in the Fens. The Saxons did not have the technical or physical capability to do anything much, and the few that lived in the Fens inhabited a desolate wasteland. This was the stuff of mythology, reinforced with broad statements by lofty academics from the seclusion of their college rooms. As he painstakingly gathered physical and documentary evidence, he increasingly found, with scarcely concealed delight, that they were wrong on key issues. In his definitive final book, Anglo-Saxon Hydraulic Engineering in the Fens, Plate 11 shows the Anglo-Saxon waterway network. There are countless rivers, diversions, canals, yet only one of them is Roman, and that's a drainage system, not a navigation. But I'm running ahead of myself because this book was preceded 8 years earlier by the equally definitive book, Crowland in the Shadow of the Abbey. Crowland is a small fenland town south of Spalding. The church is the north aisle of a ruined Norman abbey on the site of a late Saxon abbey. Crow is nothing to do with birds, but it's the Middle English word meaning a bend. The waterway which borders the town is sharply curved, as in the crowbar, which is a lever with a curved end. Crowland was the site of an early field trip Sean and I had with Judith and Michael. The fish and chip shop in North Street certainly lived up to our expectations. North Street was very wide, and Michael explained that it had previously been a waterway dug by the Saxons. One might indeed imagine it as a street in Amsterdam. The other roads had also been Saxon waterways, and there was a curious stone bridge called Trinity Bridge, raised over their intersection and now marooned on dry land. Now, not surprisingly, there were myths about this bridge, but when faced with the facts, and again to quote Michael, they melted away like the early morning mist. For Michael, the important thing about the missing Saxon waterways was to show that they were the link between the northern waterways around Stamford and the southern waterways from Peterborough down to Ely, Cambridge, and then Bury. And this meant that stone could come from the Barnard quarries to build the Great Abbey at Ely and much more. Not all field trips were to the Fens. We once stayed at Purton Green, a thatched and timbered hall house in the middle of a field in Suffolk run by the Landmark Trust. Perhaps it was to experience medieval life for a few days. The luggage, mainly delicious food provided by Judith, had to be barrowed up from the tiny car park along the headland. Dinner was eaten in style in the hall, in the freezing cold, in full outdoor clothing. To our relief, the solar was warm and we weren't disturbed by any rats. Being an engineer, Michael often called me up to ask me about something. I relished these challenges that he set me. Recently, he'd been working on a rare book dating from the early 18th century, which he found in David's bookshop. This had been commissioned by a wealthy landowner to report on the alleged difficulties of navigating boats through the Denver sluice. We agreed that the technology of the time would have enabled boats carrying people and goods to pass through the sluice at both high and low tide. Later, I was excited to find an example on YouTube from Vietnam, of all places, which I know he would have enjoyed hugely. Michael had a towering intellect and a prodigious work rate, and was a true Renaissance man, changing fields and producing groundbreaking books and articles into his 90s. He also had courage, integrity, and a passionate belief in fairness. He was, in modern parlance, a disruptor, as all good academics should be. This does not sit well with an establishment bent on self-preservation. For me, he was a kindred spirit and an inspiration in how to live life to the full.
1986, an unexpected beginning. I was in need of a plumber, and Michael offered to ring me with details of one. As a friend has said, I wanted a plumber, but I got a husband and a family. Neither of us could have foreseen or imagined such a future, the twining together so happily, so satisfyingly, of two lives. It was a joyous marriage. For the past 37 years, Michael has always been there, companionable throughout, generous, practical, analytical, supportive, above all loving. I could go on, but today I want to share a wider focus. Michael, colleague, old and new, friend and neighbour. Some years ago, I wrote a book celebrating 30 years of our local hospice called Tears, Love, Laughter. Today is a day of grief, of loss, but also of love, and I trust laughter. Michael was a diamond with sparkling surfaces, illuminating in different ways the world around him. And today, let's celebrate the extraordinary person he was. As someone wrote to me, he was a very remarkable man and had a life force and vitality that half made me think he would last forever. I was a great admirer of his lucid intelligence and tenacity. In the letters I've received, there have been many wonderful phrases capturing bits of Michael. Razor-sharp intelligence, clarity of expression, sheer intellectual power, honesty, integrity. I know he harnessed these attributes in his research, but also they underpinned all his public service, his pursuit of social justice, and his friendships. He poured everything of himself into everything he did. Michael's first job after graduating from here was in Oxford, as Annabelle said, at the Institute for Research in Agricultural Economics. I think the 5 years there honed his interest in landscape, reading it, understanding it. However often he and I took the train from Cambridge to Ely, we always looked out of the window, assessing the crops, water management. At the other end of the scale, on one trip to Australia, when we were gold kangaroos on the train from Perth to Adelaide, we abandoned the books we'd taken to read on the 43-hour journey, instead watched from the window, mesmerized by the subtlety of the ever-changing Nullarbor Desert. Recently, out of the blue, Michael said to me, he was proudest of his first and last books, written nearly 60 years apart. The first book, 1962, was Rural Settlement and Land Use. Several times he'd said to me that he'd been so unsure of its value, he nearly burnt it rather than publish it. It made his name. More recently, Michael reconnected with a rural life through Standing Stones, the Cumbrian home of friends of my family. Here, we've both come to have the privilege of being hefted to the land like sheep, able to dip into another world, another life. And it's here that over many years, Michael literally planted thousands of trees on land too steep for grazing, a source of great joy to him, despite the recent toll of ash dieback. And it's here that he's said his ashes are to be scattered. I don't know that his mind was often still. He was curious. He asked questions. Thinking about global warming and asking many years ago, did it mean more energy in the atmosphere? and so more extreme weather. Asking of a plant breeder friend over supper in our house whether a general decline in the bee population would really lead to world hunger. This prompted John, back home in Australia, to set up experiments, and with a revolutionary outcome. He asked questions of words. What meanings might the word sluice have? He was so proud of the result. When the complete Oxford English Dictionary revision gets to the letter S, the editors will add the meaning that Michael revealed. And that brings me to Michael's last book, 2021, of which he was equally proud. Anglo-Saxon hydraulic engineering in the Fens, and very readable despite to the surprise of many. This was a lockdown occupation, done at home, no access to libraries. He asked a Michael question. Was it true that only the Romans and Normans could undertake the serious water management in the Fens? Answer, a resounding no. Result, a significant impact of a book, and one which won him a local history society prize this June. But he was so much not just intellect, a writing, thinking machine. Not only a loving husband and family member, he was a great friend. He was an active member of our local community, woven into people's lives. His absence has already left a sense that the area is without its essential core. His measured advice was much valued. His support sought. He was a safe pair of hands, a listening ear. Laughter was Michael's yardstick. He'd look back on an evening spent with friends and say to me, "It was a good evening, there was a lot of laughter." As a friend wrote, one of the greatest joys of my memories of Michael, how, out of this astonishingly intense, serious, and applied brain, would suddenly emerge like a bubble, a sense of mirth, so much mirth that tears would course down his cheek. Wonderful. Michael was not dazzled by status, always more interested in substance and show. Whether he was encouraging, persuading the Duke of Buccleuch to become patron of the Spalding Gentlemen's Society, or crossing the road outside our house to chat to Jim, the man who controls the traffic flow into the ongoing building site opposite. I had to tell Jim that Michael had died. There was a pause. Then he said, "He was a proper English gent." Thank you.
Turn Again to Life by Mary Lee Hall. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others, sore undone, who keep long vigil by the silent dust. For my sake, turn to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than thine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I, perchance, may therein comfort you.
Your own sorrow and loss today is experienced in the shadow of the world's brokenness in so many ways about which Michael had written extensively in his own ways, and which both grieved his heart and fueled his passion for justice. In sorrow and in the face of such challenges, we may turn to powerful words, some of which we have heard today, that have been comforting and challenging through many generations. The words I'm about to read, which are from the Talmud, would have resonated strongly with Michael's values and character, and with the ways in which he sought to live well in complex times, whether that be through research and writing, or through tree planting, or through laughter, or through friendship, or in so many of the other ways about which we have heard today. So perhaps these words will also provide for us a blueprint for living with both sorrow and hope, and living well with both. Do not be overwhelmed by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not expected to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Our final blessing comes from a tradition that reflects both Michael's Celtic heritage and his passionate commitment to understanding and honouring and delighting in the landscapes in which we as human beings live and work and walk. So I hope these words will be a blessing from all of us to Michael and from all of us to one another. Would you please stand if you are able? Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the running water to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. And the blessing of our love go ever with you to bring you peace.